Press the stop button again instead of the pause button, so sorry about that. This will have to be part 2 of my freeform video. So I have worked out the sort of shape that I'm looking at, that I want. This may change a little bit because we're going to have to bring in this side a bit because it is a bit shallow there. But what we do, yeah, so the first step is to work out what sort of shape we want, and you can see that I've marked them there on my index wheel where my sides are. So that will make it a lot easier as I'm cutting. I'm just going to rough in some mains. I want to be cutting this depending on the depth of the stone. This isn't a really deep stone, so I'm probably going to be doing the pavilion mains at, I would like to have at least 41, possibly 42 on the keel, and then increments of 2, so maybe 42, 44, 46, 42, 44 and 46 at the girdle. Okay, so I'm just going to start roughing in the mains on a 600 and start to getting it shaped up and working at our size, because as we start bringing in the pavilion facets, we'll also be able to get a nice neat girdle line, leaving about a 1/3 for the crown. So I'm just starting to rough in some facets. As you can see, we're running out of room there on the long sides, the 2 long sides. We're not quite leaving enough room for the crown, so I'm going to have to bring those sides in a bit, which will make the stone longer and narrower, which I quite like for a freeform. When you're cutting a freeform, you have to find a shape that you find pleasing, a shape that's balanced. I've seen some freeforms and they're just not aesthetically pleasing to look at. And I think if you start putting too many sides on a freeform, like 8, 9, 10 sides, then they usually end up looking like a regular shape that isn't quite right. So they'll look a bit like an oval that's not quite right, or a round that's not quite right. Okay, so I'm just going to bring in those sides a little bit and see what we're looking like. Okay, I've brought the 2 long sides in a little bit, just so that we get enough material left to cut the crown. I've got 3 tiers of facets just roughed in there. There's still a tiny bit missing on the top there, but that'll all get brought in as I fine tune the grinding and then the pre-polishing steps. So we've got a roughly level girdle. I may have to bring in this corner a little bit. I think that should work for the crown, but that might be a bit shallow there. So what I'll probably end up doing is just bringing in that facet there on the bottom there. From 7, I'll move it around to 8 so that it cuts in a little bit more at the point. So I've got 3 tiers of facets there. I've achieved them from working backwards and forwards from the pavilion to the girdle, backwards and forwards, until we have it all shaped up in a nice proportion. I'm happy where the yellow is there. The colours in this stone should be absolutely stunning, because the blue's quite lovely too. Okay, so I'm just going to go around, make some fine adjustments and move on to pre-polish. So cutting a freeform isn't difficult. You can use all sorts of different facet types, not just step cuts. I like the long flashes of colour that the step cut gives. But you can make up your own designs. Okay, I'll get on with the fine tuning, pre-polishing, and I'll get back at that stage. Something else I'll be doing at this stage is I'm just going to move the stone over a little bit. As you can see, we have much more material on the right hand side than the left, and a little bit more to the right here. So I'm going to just gently heat up the wax and the stone and just recenter the stone before I finish up the grinding. Now the centering isn't as important with an asymmetrical design as with a symmetrical design, but it's still nice to work and get the angles all nice and even on both sides. It's just nice to work with a centered stone. Okay, so I've done some fine tuning on a fine grind, which is a worn out 600 in my case. We've got a fairly decent level girdle, leaving about a third of the stone for the crown. I've got rid of all the little chips and pieces of rough. Oh, I'm loving this stone. I've made some slight adjustments to bring that tip in here, so there's plenty of room there for the crown. I didn't want to have to adjust facets on the crown to try to get rid of that bit of rough there. Okay, now for pre-polish. Don't you love it when you pre-polish and you can just see the absolute beauty of the stone? It's just a window into the colours. It's gorgeous. So I'm pretty happy with everything here. Now what I like to do on a design that has quite sharp corners is I will just zip around them on pre-polish, just very lightly, so it just takes off the sharp corners. Now this makes it easier, I believe, for a jeweler to set the stone, especially if it's in a bezel setting or something and they're putting pressure on one of the sharp corners. It's not going to cause a stress fracture or a chip. So I think jewelers do appreciate sharp corners being taken off, especially ones like at the end there. Oh, I'm not going to focus. So I will just nick them off. Then I'm going to polish the girdle. Then I'll polish the lower tier next to the girdle and work up to the keel or the culotte. Now I did talk to a cutter recently about putting in a adjustment facet when your keel isn't level like it is in an emerald cut. They put in an adjustment facet in a freeform so that your keel will be level. I'm not sure about the absolute benefits. I think the idea is that when you're looking at the stone directly face on, you'll get a nice refraction. I think that the amount of difference that I have in my freeforms, right, it's pretty much like an emerald cut. Sorry about the focus there. It's pretty much like an emerald cut with different ends. And there isn't a lot of variation there along the keel. So when I look at my freeforms, face up, you get brightness, and then just off face up, just on the tilt, you get these beautiful flashes of colour up and down the long sides of the stone. So I'm going to finish polishing this one here and then transfer it. Okay, so I have this stone all nicely polished now. I'm really happy with it. Love the colour. A couple of things about freeforms. People ask, and emerald cuts and step cuts in general, people ask, what about the corners? So I go around each tier of facets at the same angle, and I finish the corners where they finish. So for example, that one there, I'm not aiming to make it reach the keel and doing the whole three tiers of facets. It finishes where it finishes. Now for an asher cut, for example, you are bringing the corners in at a different angle, and it gives that windmill effect. And I have seen this seen people do that for emerald cuts. I don't particularly like it, but that's a personal choice. If I wanted to, I could probably lower the angles on those corners and try to bring them up to the keel, but I don't like it. I just like letting them finish where they finish, on the same angle as the rest of the facets in that particular tier. Another thing about freeforms is that although they do give a good recovery, it's not all about getting the best recovery. You still have to have a nice shape, and I will sacrifice some of the return of the sapphire to get a nice shape. If I think a corner needs bringing in more to give a nicer shape, then I'll do it. A freeform isn't just about cutting the biggest sapphire out of a piece of rough. It's about trying to follow the natural shape of the rough and also have an attractive end faceted stone. So this one's all polished, and I'm going to transfer now.